Hello class, welcome to React Week 2. Just to get started here, I installed a new Create React app to have a fresh application, which looks like this. Looks similar to what you had last week when you tried it in class. For this class, we're going to do more going over, again, building components using props and state. We're going to cover a little bit more at the end of the class. I'm going to go over this again on Sunday. We're going to spend probably an hour or so, 45 minutes, going over it one more time. So I'm going to try to keep this video short, so you also have time to view it. Um, just to get started, we're going to build a little application, just a little to-do app, similar to the one you did in your homework. So I'm just going to make a div. I'm just going to write it out as HTML, just so we have a reference to what it will look like. So I'm going to make a to-do list, going to give it a heading. I'm just going to write basic HTML. Let's use an unordered list for the to-dos. So to-do 1, to-do 2, to-do 3, and so on. So there could be multiple, like how many ever you want. Of course, we want this to be dynamic, but we'll get to that. And we're going to have a way to add a new to-do. So in the real world, you'll probably have like an input field so you could type something yourself. We're going to go over forms and how that works in the next week. So we're not going to do that now. I'm just going to add a button that says add new to-do. So basically in just HTML, it looks like this, a header up here. We have our list of to-dos, and then we have a button to add new to-dos. Of course, this is just HTML right now, so it's not going to do anything. So the goal of this is to put this into create React components out of all of this. And then we're going to talk about props and state. And we're going to go over a little bit more stuff at the end of the class. Okay, so first off, when we build these as components, we want to identify which components we want to build. And we can see here, there's the header up here, which could be a component. It could also just be an H2 or H1 or whatever, a normal HTML header. It's not a complicated logic, so that not necessarily needs to be a component, but you could do it. Then we have a to-do list, which is the list of all the to-dos. And then we have each to-do, and then we have a button. So that would be one for the header, one for the list, one component for each row in the list, and one component for the button. Of course, this is very basic, so it might be a little more code just to write components for all of this, but for the practice, we're going to do that. Okay, don't need to remove these. Let's just get rid of the logo. We don't need that. We can keep the styling. We might need that later. Okay, so we're going to build a few components here. I'm just going to build it in one file so it makes it easier to read. So to build, let's start from the top. We're going to build a header component. It's not going to be very complicated because it's just a H2 with a text. So let's just call it to-do header. Going to use an arrow function. And we're going to return JSX because all React components return JSX. And then we're going to return, similar to what I wrote down below, going to return H2. And then we don't want to hard code this. We want to pass this in as a prop, similar to what we did last week. So I'm going to replace this now with the React component I just made. And we're just going to have, let's call it text. Could be called anything like that, because it's just a string. And I will write to-do list. So now I use my component. I pass in one prop that will be available up here then with the props object. And I will use that inside my JSX like that with the curly brackets. I'm going to say props and then the name of the prop that I chose. So text. Whoop. Text. Save that. It should look the same. And it does. You can check it. If I change it to 2, it will update it. So I made that into a component. So that's my first component. Then I'm going to make a to-do list. The to-do list would be the UL, which is the list of all of them. And then each to-do is a list item. So we're going to make a to-do list, const to-do list. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to return This is a bit tricky. Let's just do that this way. So we're gonna return the UL, but I want to have these in here. So how do I handle that? So let's just try to replace this first. We can see what it looks like. So if I add my to-do list here, to-do list, it will just be a blank UL. Right? It will be an unordered list with no items, so there will be nothing here. The one that's visible is still this one here. So if I remove that, we can see there's nothing because I haven't passed these in yet. So in order to pass these in, like I said, we want to have these as separate components. You don't always want to do this, but just we're gonna separate it as much as possible just to get the understanding of writing React components. So let's make one more that's called to-do list row. So this to-do list row will be each one of these. So we will have this 3 times for these 3 to-dos. So I will return again to do 1. And of course, also we don't want to hard code this. So I'll use my props and I can use props. Let's call it to do. So now down here, I can use my to-do list row component that I just created. And I can have to do, let's just say to do component 1. So now we're going to have 2 of these. I have this one, which is my to-do list component that uses to-do list row as a child, which is each row. And I have that hard-coded to to-do component 1. So I have this here. And then down here, I still have these that I have as just as HTML. Okay, but I want obviously to have this dynamic. I don't want to hard code all my to-dos. So how do I do that? I want to pass it in here. I want to pass in my props as to-dos. And I need to figure out a way to do that. So we're going to use an array because it's a list. So let's just have to do array. And we're going to have to do 1. So we're going to make my little array list to do 2, to do 3. Let's just do one more just so we can see that it's different than the ones that I hard coded. So I have my 4 to-dos here. I pass these in as a prop. And then up here into the to-do list, where I pass this in as to-dos, these will be available as props. Let's just see it. Console log, props. And I just need to get my developer console going. There we go. So I have this object here with the 4 to-dos, which is the props that I passed in to to-do list using an array that I pass in as a prop called to-dos. Okay, so in order to render that, when we render an array, we can use map, to-dos, map. So I will have each to-do as the first argument. Well, map is as you remember from the JavaScript class, map takes a function. The first argument of the function is the item that is currently on in the array when it iterates. So that will be a to-do. And then I can return it. Instead of hard coding it, I can take this piece of code here. Let's get rid of this. Whoop, there we go. And I can return that. So I return it. And I have my to-do list row. And instead of hard coding it, I can now use this variable, the current to-do I'm on, and I can pass that in as a prop. So now it will render the 4 to-dos. I have it as an array. It's all dynamic. I can remove this one again. So I have my array, pass it in as to-dos. Inside to the to-do list, I use my unordered list, and then I map, iterate over the array. So I use map on the array. For each, I get each item, and then I pass that in to another component as a prop, which will handle outputting the actual to-do. Okay, and then we have the button. I'm not going to build that into a component because we're going to need it as it is for now. We're going to touch that later. So now I componentized, so to speak, my HTML code with the header, the to-do list, and inside the to-do list is another component called a to-do list row. Could be called anything you want, of course. Okay, so let's just have one thing we talked about a little bit last class is called destructuring. Having these here, props.todos, props.todo, props.text, you can imagine if you have a large block of HTML, if I had 50 lines here and I had this props dot all over the place, it will get very big. It will not be as readable. So in order to make that readable, prefer to use destructuring. So destructuring, I can take the key from the object in this syntax here, const, curly brackets, because it's an object. I can take, which is the same key as the key on the props object. I can write like this, and then I say equal props. So it will take this here, and it will save it into a variable called to-dos. So when we do that, and the top of our file makes it more readable, and it makes these smaller. I don't have to write dot props, props dot whatever every time. So I can do the same here, prop to do. I'll just remove this, and I can do the same here. It's called destructuring. And there's no difference in functionality. It just makes it easier to read. If you had some components will have 15 of these props, and it will have 50 lines of HTML, and it just makes everything a little more nice when you do it in this way. But either way works, and either way is okay. Okay, so it still works the same. We can see we have one error here. Each child in a list should contain a unique key prop. We saw that last time as well. This happens when you iterate over an array that returns a React component. React will not be able to tell these apart because it doesn't create them itself. It's created in an array or in an iteration. So we use key to help React identify what I added, what I changed, what needs to be removed so it can tell them apart. So it needs to have something uniquely to identify it. So in order to get rid of this warning, which will always happen when you use a map, unless you give it a key, I'm just going to give it a key and I'm going to just use the to do because I know it's unique for this application because they're 1, 2, 3, 4. They might not be. So if they're not unique, you would have to find some way to make them unique. There is a second argument to map called index, which will be 0 for the first one, and then 1, 2, 3. So that would be unique. Index is not best practice to use as a key because arrays can change even if the content does not change. So if you use the index, then React will re-render the component if the index changes, even if the content has not changed. But it does work to use index. You could have used index here, and that would also have made it unique and would also make the problem go away. But it's not recommended. I'm going to use to do. I'm going to remove the index here. Okay. So now we have a little component here. So we want to have this dynamic. And how do we handle that? We briefly touched about in the video last time something called state, where state is something that happens internally in a component that can allow you to change the content within a well, that's a bit hard way to say it. When I add a new to-do, you can imagine I need to add one here called to-do 5. But how do I actually handle that? Because this is defined, this array is defined outside the component. It's not possible for us to change it, at least not in a good way. So we need to find some way where we can add a to-do 5 to this when I click the button. And the only way, because how many times, every time I click the button, it should add a new to-do. So how can I actually do that? So we'll try to, let's just see. We'll try to use state for this. And like I talked about last time, we're going to use something called hooks, which is called use state. It's a hook that allows you to implement state into a functional component. It will not work in a class-based component. We touched about that briefly last time, but we're going to focus on functional components. So we're going to use state. So I have this to-dos array. And I want to have this inside my state because I want to be able to modify it. So the state looks like this. Let's just call this, the state looks like, let's just do it like this. So we have useState, which is a function. The first argument of the function is the initial state. So the initial state we already defined here. We already have these 4 to-dos, which apparently is hard-coded, which is fine for now. So I can put this into the argument for useState. So that will be the initial state. This function will return an array with 2 items. And the way you write that when you use these hooks is you use destructuring, just like I did with the object. But when you do it on an array, you use the array syntax. So you use the brackets. So the first index, let's say that there are 2 things that are returned. The first one is the to-dos, which is the current state. So when I do it like this, when it first runs the initial state, that's also going to be the current state. So right now, when I use this, I put the initial state, which is this array here, in here, and that's going to be available to me on this to-dos. The second argument is set. It's a setter. So it's a function that allows us to update the state. So let's just call it set to-dos. So now I have these 2 here. Let's try the console log. You can see that the first one, there are 2 things that are returned here. The first one is the to-do 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's the initial state. It's the array I passed in here. And the second, you can see, if you can see it here, well, I'm not sure you can read it, but it's a function. So instead of just passing into to-dos array, which is a hard-coded array, I will pass in the to-dos that I have in my state. And it will look the same because we know that I already put it into the initial state. It will save it into the to-dos. And I will be able to use that by passing it down as a prop to the to-do list. So the to-do list doesn't change. It still receives the same array. Okay. So how do you determine if something should be a state prop, a state, or it should be a prop? So let's just say, let's just add a header actually. We can add this header text here. We'll make it a better example. So instead of having the header here, I'm just going to move that up to the to-do list. Just going to put it there. And I'm going to see I passed it in as a prop to the to-do list. It's going to format it a little bit so it's easy to see. I have the props now, to-dos, and then I have this header text, which is my to-do list, which is the header, this one over here. So instead of using to-do header inside this component, I will use it inside this component instead. So just use destructuring to get my header text, and I will put it here as a dynamic. Now it's a prop that I can pass in instead. Oh, broke that. There we go. Why does that not work? Oh, yeah. So we have this, some of you had this error last time. Adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. That means that you cannot return 2 root elements. So I return this one and I return this one. So I need to have 1 element at the root when I have a React class. I cannot have 2. So I'm just going to put a div around all of this. There we go. Okay. So now I see here 2 things that I pass into this. I have my state and I have a prop. Both of them are props from the to-do list point of view. Both of them are props, but one of them is managed as state inside app with useState, and the other one is managed just as a hard-coded text. So what is the difference between them? So props, you could think of that as configuration options. So things that are just configured for the app that doesn't need to change. And state, on the other hand, is optional. You don't have to use it, but it allows you to read and write um, the state, the value of the variable from inside the component. So you can update this. Let's try to see how it works. That would be easier. So when you use state, you always use, if you want to update state, you always have to use the function. If I try to do this, it would work, but it would break React. Well, now it's a constant. Let's just let it won't let me update it. See, I can overwrite it here. It will be easy to see this later. We're gonna try that later. But I can overwrite it, but it will not work. If you want to update this variable here, the state, you always use the setter. So you use set to do's. Let's just try it. It will be easier to understand once we make a little more complete example. Okay, so for what my point is here is that I want to be able to click this add new to do, and it should add a fifth one or a sixth one. It should keep adding them. So a button. A button has an on-click attribute, which is also a prop, and we can pass in a function for that. On button click, we're just going to call it click. Just going to call it on button click, which is a function, and we're going to console log when that runs, I was clicked. So we can pass this function in as a prop on the button. Let's look at the console. So now when I click the button, it's going to say I was clicked. I'm pointing with my finger here in the console. It's going to run this function every time I click the button. So that's good for us. So that allows us to have some dynamic content. I'm just going to change the formatting so you can see it. Okay, so it says I was clicked. So how do we figure out, now we want to add a new to do. We want to call it to do 5, just for the sake of having the numbers. So how do we figure out what number we need to add? We already know we can use, if you remember your array, the methods that are available on the array. Let's just call it, we'll make a new variable called array length. And we're just going to say to do array length. So that will give us the length of the do. So this will be 3 because it counts from 0, 1, 2, 3. And I want to have 3 plus 1, right? I want to add, I don't want, let's just try it. It'll be easier. So length. So I want to update my to-dos. So I'm going to make a new variable, my next to-dos. And it's going to be to-do list to-dos. And we could use push. Let's just try push first. Gonna make the name for it, my next to-do name, which is gonna use to-do. I'm gonna use array length. Remember this string literals, where I can put variables inside the string? Let's just comment this out. I'm gonna look at it again in a second. So let's say I was clicked, and let's just console log out the next name so you can see what it looks like. See, now it says I was clicked to do 4. And that's because the array length counts from 0. So when there's 4 elements here, it's gonna say 3. So we're gonna just add plus 1. So now it's gonna say, when I click it, it's gonna say I was clicked to do 5. So to do 5 is the next one. That's the one we want to add. So there are several ways to do this. You could just to-dos. Let's just try first to just push it into the to-dos. So push will add it to the end of the array. Need to write the correct name. Push will add it to the end of the array, but nothing happens. You can see in the console that it keeps adding these, and you can see that it actually adds it into the array because the first time I said I was clicked to do 5, then we'll see to do 6, to do 7, and so on, and it will keep going. So it actually works on some level, but it doesn't update the view. The reason it doesn't update the view is because I just push it into this variable, and it's not allowed to update this. This is called mutation, and if you mutate this, that means that React will not know that you updated this. So it will not re-render the page. It will not be able to detect that this was updated because we just update the variable directly. We can only update this variable by using the setter. So using this function over here to update it. So instead of using push, I'm going to use, let's just say, let's get rid of this comment I wrote here. So that was push, which is not necessary. Oh, sorry. Which is not allowed to update these directly. So we're going to use something called, let's just make a new variable. Let's get rid of that. Make a new variable called my next to-dos. And we're going to use the to-dos array that we already have, the current value of this in the state. And we're going to use something called Concat. So Concat, it works the same. It will still push it to the end of the array, so it will still add it to the array. But instead of mutating the existing array, it's going to add it, and then it's going to return that array as a new array. Let's try it here. Let's just see. Just comment to log this. So we can see that it gets added, but the difference is towards push. Like push will cannot access my next to dos before. Oh, yeah, I did it again. Need to write the correct name. There we go. So when I click it, I can see that it gets added. We have to do 5 now. We have to do 6. Well, it doesn't, it's not 6 because it still checks the current state. It uses the length of the state. I made a bug here. I use the array out here to count. I need to use the current state to count. So we can see I added. It adds to do 5 each time. So it works similar to push, but it doesn't mutate the array. It returns a new array. So returning a new array, I can then set that new array, set to-dos, my next to-dos. Just get rid of this. So I update the state with set to-dos. I set the new array that I created with the original state, including the one I just created. So when I click the button now, it will create a to-do 5, to-do 6, and it will keep going. So what actually happens here? So I click the button, I check what the length is, how many to-dos do I currently have in my state. I save that in a variable. Then I create the next name I want to add. I say it's called to-do, the length of the current array, plus 1, because it counts from 0 to get the way humans count. And then I will take that name, and I will add it to the end of the current to-dos that are in the state. I use concat instead of push because push mutates the array. It just changes the same. It doesn't create a new array with the new data. It just adds it to the end of the current array, and then React will not be able to pick it up. And then I take that new array. I use the setter, set state, and then when I use the setter, then to-dos is going to update to this new array with 5 items, and React is going to re-render the application. So it's going to pass it in here now with 5, and then this one is going to map and it's going to show 5. So I can keep going, and it will just keep adding these things. Okay. So state allows us to update things dynamically inside a component, and props is something that we just pass in that is static. So in this example, we use state in the app component. It could also be some of the other components. And inside these other components, we just use props. We just use the props that are passed in from outside. And this allows this to be very reusable because anyone can pass a number of to-dos in and a header text, and it will render this beautiful application that we have here. Um, and this is a good way to do it because as the more components you have that only uses props, it makes them simpler, it makes them easier to read, it makes them easier to reuse. And state is necessary also when you have dynamic content. But it's a good way to, for instance, like in this example, we have state here and we just pass the value of the state as a prop to the next component. So this to-do list doesn't know that to-dos comes from a state object. It doesn't care. It just gets it as a prop. But the application here will maintain a state of how many to-dos are added, and it will allow us to keep adding these as many times as we want. I'm going to put this code in the channel after this code, after this video. Let's just see. Okay, so that was a little bit about state and props. We're going to work with this in the exercises. I'm just going to pause the video for a bit and then I'll continue.